December 11th, 2008, early morning in Manhattan, at a luxury penthouse apartment on East 64th Street, overlooking Central Park, one of the most prestigious addresses in New York, and told them something that would destroy not only his life but theirs as well. That would unravel one of the largest criminal enterprises in history. That would devastate thousands of investors, collapse charitable organizations, ruin families, and expose catastrophic failures in financial regulation. He told them that his investment advisory business, the business that managed billions of dollars for some of the wealthiest people and institutions in the world, the business that had generated consistent returns year after year, regardless of market conditions, the business that made him a legend, was entirely fraudulent, completely fake. Nothing but a Ponzi scheme that had been running for decades, and that he was about to lose everything. His sons were stunned, devastated, unable to comprehend what they were hearing, because Bernie Madoff wasn't just any businessman. He was their father, their mentor, the man they worked for, the man whose reputation they had built their own careers on. And now he was telling them it was all a lie, all built on fraud, that there were no investments, no trading strategies, no legitimate returns, just money being moved from new investors to pay fake returns to old investors in the classic structure of a Ponzi scheme, named after Charles Ponzi, who ran a similar scam in the 1920s. Mark and Andrew did what they had to do, what the law required, what their conscience demanded. They called their lawyer, who called the FBI. And the next morning, December 12, 2008, FBI agents arrested Bernie Madoff at his penthouse, and the biggest financial fraud in American history. A fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for possibly 50 years, finally came crashing down. This is the story of how Bernie Madoff built his empire on lies, how he stole $65 billion, how he fooled some of the smartest investors in the world, how regulators failed to stop him despite multiple warnings, and how his crimes destroyed lives, families. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born April 29, 1938, in the Queensboro of New York City, to Ralph and Sylvia Madoff, a middle-class Jewish family where his father worked as a plumber and his mother tried various business ventures, which may have planted the seeds for his later obsession with wealth, status, and appearing successful regardless of reality. He was smart, ambitious, charming, good with numbers, and he attended Hofstra University where he studied political science, and then he briefly attended Brooklyn Law School, but dropped out after 1 year, deciding instead to start his own business. And in 1960, at just 22 years old, with $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems, Bernie Madoff founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment. In the early years, Madoff's business was legitimate, genuinely innovative, actually groundbreaking in some ways that changed how Wall Street operated. Because Bernie pioneered the use of computer technology for trading stocks, creating electronic systems that could execute trades faster and more efficiently than the traditional floor trading that dominated the New York Stock Exchange. And this legitimate side of his business, the market-making operation where he bought and sold stocks for other firms and earned small profits on the spread between buying and selling prices, was genuinely successful, genuinely profitable, genuinely respected in the industry. He became chairman of NASDAQ, the electronic stock exchange, in 1990, 1991, and 1993. He served on various regulatory committees and industry boards. He was consulted by the SEC on market structure and trading rules. He was seen as an elder statesman of Wall Street, a pioneer who had helped modernize the entire industry. And this reputation, this aura of respectability and success, became the perfect cover for the fraud he was running simultaneously. At some point, and investigators have never been able to determine exactly when, possibly as early as the 1960s, but more likely in the 1970s or early 1980s, Bernie Madoff started running a second business alongside his legitimate trading operation, an investment advisory service that promised to manage money for wealthy individuals and institutions. And this advisory business operated completely differently from the trading business, much more secretively, much more exclusively, with Bernie personally selecting clients and often turning away people who wanted to invest, which only made the opportunity seem more desirable, more elite, more special. He claimed to use a sophisticated investment strategy he called split strike conversion, which involved buying stocks and using options to limit downside risk while preserving upside potential. And he produced statements showing consistent returns of 10 to 12% per year. Year after year, regardless of whether the market was up or down, bull market or bear market, recession or expansion. Always steady, always positive, always reliable, which should have been impossible, but which Bernie claimed to achieve through his unique strategy and his superior market knowledge. The investment advisory business grew slowly at first, through word of mouth, through referrals, through feeder funds that raised money from their own clients, and then invested it with Madoff in exchange for fees. And Bernie cultivated an image of exclusivity and discretion, meeting with clients at his office, but keeping the investment operation on a separate floor, literally downstairs in the building, where only a handful of employees worked and where visitors were rarely allowed. And this secrecy only enhanced his mystique, made investing with Bernie feel like belonging to an exclusive club, like having access to something special that ordinary investors couldn't access. He invested money for celebrities like Steven Spielberg and Kevin Bacon, for wealthy families and trust funds, for charities including the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity and various Jewish charitable organizations that trusted him because he was a prominent member of their community, for country clubs and pension funds and universities, for feeder funds like the Fairfield Greenwich Group that raised billions specifically to invest with Madoff. And all of these investors, these sophisticated, wealthy, supposedly savvy people, believed they were making smart, safe investments with one of the most respected names on Wall Street. But none of it was real, not a single trade, not one investment, not any of the returns that Bernie reported on the statements he sent to clients every month. Why? Because what Bernie was actually doing was taking money from new investors and using it to pay fake returns to existing investors whenever they wanted to withdraw money. The classic structure of a Ponzi scheme that can only survive as long as new money keeps coming in faster than old money is being withdrawn. A mathematical impossibility that must eventually collapse. And Bernie knew this, knew from the beginning that it couldn't last forever, knew that he was building a house of cards that would eventually fall, but he kept doing it anyway, kept bringing in new investors, kept producing fake statements, kept lying to everyone, including his family, for reasons that even he may not have fully understood. A combination of greed and ego, and the remarkable thing about Bernie Madoff's fraud is not that he got away with it for so long, but that so many people suspected something was wrong, raised questions, conducted investigations, and yet the fraud continued unchecked because the red glaring to anyone who looked carefully. But a combination of Madoff's reputation, regulatory incompetence, and willful blindness by people who were making money from his supposed success, allowed the fraud to continue for decades. The first major red flag was the consistency of returns, because in real financial markets, even the best investors have losing years, have periods of poor performance, experience volatility. But Bernie's returns were steady as clockwork. Never a major loss, never significant volatility, always that reliable 10 to 12% regardless of market conditions. And any sophisticated investor should have known this was statistically impossible, that no legitimate strategy could produce such consistent results. But people wanted to believe, wanted access to Bernie's magic. And so they didn't ask hard questions or demand satisfactory answers. The second red flag was opacity and secrecy, because Bernie refused to explain his strategy in detail, refused to let clients or potential investors see the actual trades being executed, refused to use any of the major custodian banks that typically hold assets for investors, instead claiming to hold everything himself. And he employed a tiny unknown accounting firm called Freeling and Horowitz that operated out of a small office in New City, New York, with only 3 employees, including the accountant's wife, to audit billions of dollars in supposed investments, which should have been absurd, impossible, an immediate warning sign that something was wrong. Legitimate hedge funds and investment advisors use major accounting firms, provide transparency to clients, allow independent verification of holdings and trades. But Bernie operated in secrecy, claimed his strategy was proprietary and couldn't be disclosed. And, incredibly, people accepted this, didn't push back, didn't demand the transparency that their investments warranted. The third and most damning red flag was Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst and fraud investigator who figured out that Madoff's returns were impossible, mathematically impossible, and who tried repeatedly to alert the Securities and Exchange Commission that Bernie was running a Ponzi scheme, submitting detailed reports, providing evidence, explaining exactly why the returns couldn't be legitimate. And yet the SEC did nothing, investigated Madoff multiple times, but never uncovered the fraud, missed obvious warning signs, accepted Bernie's explanations without verifying them, demonstrated incompetence so profound that it raises questions about whether the failure was merely negligence or something more sinister like regulatory capture, where the agency tasked with oversight was too friendly with the people they were supposed to be monitoring. Markopolos, first suspected Madoff, was a fraud in 1999, nearly 10 years before the collapse, and he submitted a detailed report to the SEC titled "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud" in 2005, 3 years before the collapse, explaining in clear terms why Madoff's returns were impossible, why the strategy he claimed to use couldn't generate the results he reported, why the whole operation was obviously fraudulent, and the SEC did nothing effective, allowing the fraud to continue, allowing billions more to be stolen. Between 1992 and 2008, the SEC conducted investigations of Madoff at least 8 times, examining his operations, reviewing his records, interviewing him and his employees. And every single time they failed to uncover the fraud, failed to ask the right question, failed to verify that the trades Bernie claimed to be making were actually happening, failed to follow up on obvious inconsistencies, and in some cases actually cleared him and gave him a clean bill of health that he then used to reassure nervous investors that he had been examined by regulators and found to be legitimate. The reasons for these failures are multiple and interconnected. The SEC investigators were often young, inexperienced, intimidated by Madoff's reputation and credentials, They didn't understand the trading strategies well enough to know they were impossible. They accepted Madoff's explanations at face value without independent verification. They focused on minor compliance issues rather than investigating the fundamental question of whether the returns were real. And they may have been subject to regulatory capture where Madoff's status as a former NASDAQ chairman and frequent SEC consultant made them less likely to suspect him of fraud. There were also investors and feeder funds who suspected something was wrong, but didn't want to rock the boat because they were making money, earning fees, benefiting from the steady returns that Bernie provided, and so they chose not to ask hard questions, chose to believe, rather chose complicity over curiosity. Some major banks and investment firms actually refused to invest with Madoff or pulled their money out after conducting due diligence and determining that his returns didn't make sense. But they didn't report their suspicions to regulators, didn't warn other investors, just quietly protected themselves while allowing others to continue being defrauded. This culture of willful blindness, of not wanting to kill the golden goose, of prioritizing personal profit over truth and justice, was pervasive in the financial industry and was essential to allowing Madoff's fraud to continue for so long. Because if even a fraction of the people who suspected something was wrong had spoken up publicly, had demanded answers, had refused to participate, the scheme would have collapsed years earlier, and billions of dollars in losses might have been prevented. The end, when it finally came, was swift and inevitable, triggered not by investigators finally uncovering the fraud, but by the 2008 financial crisis that devastated global markets, collapsed major financial institutions, and caused investors everywhere to pull money out of risky investments and move to safety. And this created an impossible situation for Bernie Madoff, because his Ponzi scheme required a steady inflow of new money to pay returns to existing investors. And when the financial crisis hit, new investments dried up. Existing investors started withdrawing money in large amounts. And Bernie didn't have the cash to meet the redemption requests because the money wasn't invested in anything, wasn't earning real returns, had been spent or stolen, or used to pay previous investors. And he was facing a liquidity crisis that he couldn't solve, couldn't fake his way through, couldn't survive. In November 28, investors requested redemptions totaling $7 billion, far more than Bernie had in cash. And he tried to meet some of these requests by bringing in new money, by asking existing clients to invest more, by promising even better returns. But it wasn't enough. The math didn't work. The scheme was unraveling, and Bernie knew it, knew the end was coming, knew he had run out of time and options. He later told investigators that he had been planning to confess, to turn himself in at the end of the year, after paying out year-end bonuses to employees who worked on the legitimate trading side of his business and had no knowledge of the fraud, to give himself one more Christmas with his family before everything collapsed. But events moved faster than he anticipated. The pressure became too great. And on December 10th, 28, Bernie told his brother Peter, who was chief compliance officer at the firm, that he was finished, that he was going to surrender to authorities. And Peter was shocked, apparently had no idea about the fraud despite working at the company for decades. On the morning of December 11th, Bernie called his sons Mark and Andrew to his apartment and told them the truth, told them everything was a fraud, that the investment advisory business was completely fictitious, that there were no real investments, no real returns, that it was all a Ponzi scheme, and that he expected to be arrested soon. And his sons were devastated, couldn't believe what they were hearing, struggled to process that their father, the man they had idolized and worked for their entire careers, had been running a massive fraud right under their noses, using their names and reputations to add legitimacy to his crimes. They immediately called their lawyer, Martin Flumenbaum, who called the U.S. Attorney's Office, who contacted the FBI, and agents were dispatched to arrest Madoff. And according to the FBI report, when agents knocked on his door early on the morning of December 12th and identified themselves, Bernie said, "I know why you're here." And when they asked if he had an innocent explanation for what he had done, he said there is no innocent explanation. Bernie Madoff was arrested and charged with securities fraud, and within hours the news broke globally, shocking Wall Street, devastating investors, dominating headlines around the world. And as details emerged about the scope of the fraud, about how much money was involved, about how many people and institutions had been defrauded, about how long it had been going on, the magnitude of the crime became clear. This wasn't just another Wall Street scandal. This wasn't a case of aggressive accounting or questionable judgment. This was the largest Ponzi scheme in history, potentially the largest financial fraud ever committed, with losses estimated at $65 billion based on the account statements Bernie had sent to clients. Though the actual money invested was probably around $20 billion, with the rest being fake returns that Bernie had reported, but never actually generated. The victims were numerous and devastating, ranging from individual investors who lost their life savings to celebrities and wealthy families who lost fortunes, to charitable organizations that lost their endowments and had to shut down, to pension funds and university endowments that lost money intended for retirees and students, and the human cost was incalculable, with reports of suicides, heart attacks, financial ruin, families destroyed, people in their 70s and 80s who had trusted Bernie with their retirement money and now faced poverty. Some victims had every penny invested with Madoff, had been told by feeder funds that they were diversified when in reality everything was going to one place, to one massive fraud that left them with nothing, and the emotional trauma of being betrayed by someone they trusted, someone from their own community, someone who had cultivated personal relationships and exploited those relationships for criminal gain, was as painful as the financial loss itself. Bernie Madoff's trial process was swift because he pled guilty, choosing not to fight the charges, not to contest the facts, not to put his family through a lengthy public trial, though whether this decision was motivated by remorse or by a desire to. On March 12, 2009, just 3 months after his arrest, Bernie stood before Judge Denny Chin in federal court in Manhattan and pled guilty to 11 counts, including securities, fraud, investment advisor, fraud, wire money laundering, perjury, and making false filings with a C key. And when Judge Chin asked if he had committed these crimes, Bernie said yes. And when asked if he understood he was facing a maximum sentence of 150 years in prison, Bernie said yes, and the proceeding took less than. With Bernie admitting guilt, but showing no visible emotion, no tears, no apparent remorse, just a calm acceptance of his fate. Sentencing came 3 months later on June 29, 2009, and it was a moment of high drama, with the courtroom packed with victims who had come to see justice served, to see Bernie punished, to tell the judge how his crimes had affected their lives. And one by one victims spoke, many elderly, many crying, telling stories of life savings lost, retirement plans destroyed, having to go back to work in their 70s, losing their homes, their security, their ability to help children and grandchildren, all because they trusted Bernie Madoff. Judge Chin listened to the victim impact statements, reviewed the present-tensing report, considered the magnitude of the crime and the devastation it had caused, and then he delivered a sentence that made headlines around the world: 150 years in prison, the maximum possible sentence, ensuring that Bernie Madoff, then 71 years old, would die in prison, would never again walk free, would spend every remaining day of his life behind bars paying for his crimes. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge Chin said that Bernie's crimes were extraordinarily evil and represented a breach of trust on a massive scale, that Bernie had stolen from widows and orphans, from charities and foundations, from friends and family members, that he had shown no remorse, and had demonstrated through his actions a complete disregard for the suffering he caused, and that the sentence needed to reflect not only the magnitude of the financial loss, but also the human cost, the trust betrayed, the lives destroyed, and the message that needed to be sent that such crimes would be punished with the maximum severity available under law. Bernie was immediately remanded to custody and sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, and later transferred to Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina, a medium-security prison where he would spend the rest of his life. But the consequences extended far beyond Bernie himself, destroying his entire family in ways that make this story even more tragic. Because whether or not his family members knew about the fraud, and the evidence suggests most of them didn't know, they paid enormous prices for Bernie's crimes. His wife Ruth, who had worked at the firm in the early years and had been married to Bernie for 50 years, claimed she knew nothing about the fraud, and investigators found no evidence she was involved in the criminal enterprise. But she lost everything anyway. Her reputation destroyed, her social standing evaporated, many of her friends and family members refusing to speak to her, forced to surrender virtually all her assets to help compensate victims, left with just $2.5 million from the billions the family had accumulated, living in Connecticut in relative isolation, a pariah blamed by association even if not legally culpable. Bernie's two sons, Mark and Andrew, who worked at the legitimate trading side of the business and who investigators concluded did not know about the investment advisory fraud, faced suspicion, lawsuits, investigations, and public condemnation that ultimately destroyed both of them. Mark Madoff, the older son who had turned his father in to authorities, struggled with depression, guilt, and the constant scrutiny and accusations. And on December 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years after Bernie confessed to him, Mark hanged himself in his Manhattan apartment, while his 2-year-old son slept in the next room, leaving a suicide note saying he couldn't live with the shame and the accusations and the destruction of his life, and his death was a direct consequence of his father's crimes. Even though Mark himself had done nothing wrong, had in fact done the right thing by reporting the fraud. Andrew Madoff, the younger son, fought to clear his name, cooperated with investigators, tried to rebuild his life. But the stress and the trauma took a physical toll, and he was diagnosed with cancer, mantle cell lymphoma, which he had beaten once before, but which returned after his father's arrest. And doctors believed the stress of the scandal contributed to the cancer's return. And Andrew died on September 3rd, 2014. At age 48, another victim of Bernie's crimes, another life destroyed by the fraud. And he died estranged from his father, having refused to speak to Bernie after the fraud was revealed, having publicly said that Bernie was dead to him, that he could never forgive what his father had done to him, to his brother, to thousands of innocent people. Bernie himself showed little visible remorse even after being sentenced. giving interviews from prison where he claimed he didn't think he was evil, just stupid, where he minimized his crimes by saying that his clients were greedy and should have known the returns were too good to be true, where he blamed regulators for not catching him, where he suggested that victims should have diversified rather than investing everything with him, essentially blaming everyone but himself, showing a narcissism and lack of empathy that made his crimes even more disturbing. He died in prison on April 14th, 2021, at age 82 of natural causes, having served less than 12 years of his 150-year sentence. And when news of his death was announced, many victims said they felt no satisfaction, no closure, no sense that justice had truly been served, because Bernie had taken the easy way out, had died relatively peacefully, while many of his victims were still suffering the financial and emotional consequences of his fraud more than a decade later. The Bernie Madoff scandal taught us, or should have taught us, critical lessons about financial regulation, about due diligence, about trust and verification, about how fraud flourishes in environments where reputation substitutes for scrutiny, where people want to believe so badly that they ignore obvious warning signs, where regulators are either incompetent or captured by the industries they're supposed to police. And yet, more than a decade later, we continue to see similar frauds, similar failures, similar situations where people who should know better get taken in by schemes that are obviously too good to be true. The first lesson is about the importance of skepticism, particularly when investment returns seem unusually good or unusually consistent. Because in real markets, volatility is normal, losses are inevitable, and anyone promising steady returns regardless of market conditions is either phenomenally skilled, which is extremely rare, or lying, which is much more common. And investors need to be willing to ask hard questions, demand proof, verify claims independently, rather than trusting based on reputation or relationships. The second lesson is about regulatory reform and the need for the SEC to be properly funded, properly staffed with people who have the expertise to understand complex financial instruments and trading strategies, and properly independent from the industries and individuals they regulate. Because the SEC's failure to catch Madoff despite multiple investigations and explicit warnings from Harry Markopolos represents a catastrophic breakdown in the regulatory system that was supposed to protect investors from exactly this kind of fraud. After the Madoff scandal, there were reforms, increased whistleblower protections, larger rewards for people who report fraud, more resources for investigating tips and complaints. But whether these changes are sufficient, whether the SEC has truly learned the lessons of its failure, whether similar frauds could happen again today, remains an open question that the financial industry and investors should be concerned about. The third lesson is about the importance of independent verification and transparency. Because Bernie operated in secrecy, refused to use independent custodians, employed a tiny unknown accounting firm, didn't allow investors to see actual trades or verify holdings, and these should have been automatic disqualifiers for any sophisticated investor or institution. Yet people invested anyway because they trusted Bernie's reputation, wanted access to his returns, and didn't want to offend him by demanding transparency. The lesson is clear. Never invest money without independent verification. Never accept secrecy as a condition of investing. Never trust reputation over proof, because as the saying goes, trust but verify, and in Madoff's case, nobody verified. Everyone just trusted. and that trust cost them $65 billion. The fourth lesson is about the human capacity for self-deception and the power of cognitive biases. Because many of Madoff's investors were sophisticated, intelligent, financially savvy people who should have known better but who fell victim to confirmation bias. The tendency to seek out information that confirms what we want to believe and ignore information that contradicts it. And to the halo effect, where we assume that someone who is successful or respected in one area must be trustworthy in all areas. Bernie cultivated this image carefully. His reputation as a NASDAQ chairman, an industry pioneer, created a halo that made people less likely to question his investment returns. And his exclusivity and selectivity made people feel privileged to invest with him, made them less likely to ask hard questions for fear of losing access. And these psychological factors were as important to the fraud's success as any of the technical aspects. The legacy of Bernie Madoff extends beyond the specific case to affect how we think about white-collar crime, about appropriate punishment, about whether financial fraud is taken seriously enough by the justice system. Because while Bernie got 150 years, many people involved in financial frauds receive much lighter sentences, serve minimal time. They emerge with their wealth largely intact and able to resume comfortable lives. And there's a widespread perception that white-collar criminals are treated with kid gloves compared to street criminals who commit far less damaging crimes but receive much harsher punishment. Bernie's case was unusual in the severity of the sentence. Judge Chin specifically wanted to send a message. But even then, Bernie served only 12 years before dying of natural causes. And many victims felt that wasn't enough, that true justice would have required Bernie to experience more suffering, more loss, more of the pain that he inflicted on thousands of people whose lives he destroyed. The Irving Picard, the trustee appointed to recover money for Madoff's victims, has worked for more than a decade to claw back funds from people who profited from the fraud, even if they didn't know it was a fraud. And this process has been controversial because it involves suing people who thought they had legitimately earned returns on their investments, people who had no idea they were receiving stolen money. But the legal principle is clear. Nobody has a right to keep money that was stolen, even if they received it innocently. And so the trustee has recovered more than $14 billion through settlements and lawsuits, returning about 70% of the principal that victims invested, though nowhere near the full amount shown on their statements because most of those returns were fictitious, never actually existed, were just numbers on paper that Bernie made up. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Madoff case is how it reveals the fragility of trust in financial systems, because markets and investments fundamentally depend on trust. On the belief that statements are accurate, that trades are real, that returns are legitimate, that regulators are watching, that fraud will be detected and punished. And when that trust is violated as completely as Bernie violated it, when someone at the highest levels of Wall Street, someone with every credential and every connection and every reason to be trustworthy, turns out to be running a multi-decade fraud, it damages the entire system. It makes investors more skeptical, makes it harder for legitimate investment advisors to attract clients, creates paranoia and suspicion that can be as damaging as the fraud itself. Today, more than 15 years after the fraud was exposed, Bernie Madoff's name remains synonymous with financial fraud, with Ponzi schemes, with the dangers of trusting without verifying, and with the catastrophic damage that one person can do when motivated by greed and enabled by regulatory failure and willful blindness. His crimes destroyed thousands of lives, collapsed charitable organizations, traumatized an entire community, killed his sons either directly or indirectly, and left a legacy of suspicion and caution that may ultimately be healthy for financial markets but came at an enormous cost. The question that remains unanswered, that may never be fully answered, is why Bernie did it. What motivated him to continue the fraud year after year, decade after decade, even as he became wealthy from his legitimate business, even as he gained respect and status and influence, why he couldn't stop, couldn't come clean, couldn't find a way out of the trap he had created for himself. And the answer probably lies in some combination of greed, ego, fear of failure, addiction to the respect that his false success brought him, and a psychological disconnect that allowed him to compartmentalize his crimes, to see himself as different from other criminals, to justify his actions as somehow less harmful than they were, right up until the moment when the whole house of cards finally collapsed and he had to face the truth of what he had done and who he had become. This has been the story of Bernie Madoff, the man who built a financial empire on lies, who ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history for possibly 50 years, who stole $65 billion from thousands of investors, including friends, family members, charities, and institutions that trusted him, who fooled regulators, auditors, and sophisticated investors who should have known better, whose fraud was enabled by regulatory failure, willful blindness, and the human tendency to believe what we want to believe rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. The story of how the fraud finally collapsed in December 2008, when the financial crisis made it impossible to continue. How Bernie confessed to his sons, who turned him in. How he was arrested and charged and sentenced to 150 years in prison. How his family was destroyed. How his sons died. How thousands of victims lost everything. And how more than a decade later, we're still trying to understand how it happened. How it went on so long. How so many people missed so many warning signs. And what lessons we should learn to prevent the next Bernie Madoff from stealing billions before anyone notices. Because if there's one certainty in financial markets, it's that greed and fraud are constant, that there will always be people willing to lie and steal, and that our only protection is skepticism, verification, transparency, and regulation that actually works, rather than regulation that exists on paper, but fails in practice. Which is what happened with Bernie Madoff, and which could happen again if we don't learn from this catastrophic failure of oversight, of due diligence, of basic human judgment, about who to trust and why.